Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'm your host for Culturally Determined. And my guest today is Christa Blackmon. Christa, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Christa, and I am currently living in London after graduating from the School of Oriental and African Studies with a master's in social anthropology. I focus on a lot of media topics and a lot of political topics where they intersect with arts and culture. So I guess you could say I write a lot about political art. I write and research a lot about political art, but also about news media. And one of my big research topics is the ethics of viewing human suffering on screen. And today, what I'm really looking forward to getting into is not the sadness of viewing someone on screen who's in pain, but when people on screen turn painful topics into jokes.
Yeah, so you have a blog called Site of Suffering that will be linked to below. And
yes.
You had a post recently about joking about Nazis and Hitler.
Yes.
So that's mainly what we're going to be talking about today, but we'll maybe find some connections to more current stuff.
Yes.
So your post is called "When is Dressing Up Like Hitler Okay?" and is illustrated with a rather striking image of Mel Brooks doing a little. It looks like he's holding like a comb or something up to his lips to do a Hitler mustache and raising his hand in the Nazi salute.
And it's clearly a recent picture too.
Yeah. He looks pretty old in this shot. So he's still going with the shtick that he developed in the 60s. So I guess to begin with, what drew you to this particular topic?
Well, I actually originally wrote the blog post for Lawyers, Guns, and Money, which your colleague Robert Farley was kind enough to invite me to start contributing on. And one day I saw like a tweet about it, like when you just had your coffee in the morning and you're ready to get mad about something. And I just saw somebody tweet like, "You wouldn't make Nazi jokes, would you?" And I thought, what the hell? Where have you been? Have you not? And, all these people were, I forget who it was, but all these people were responding with these really highbrow people, in literature, making all these jokes, people that I don't think I've ever heard of. And I thought, come on, man, Mel Brooks, the most obvious, the most obvious example of Nazi jokes. Yes. And so I kind of got a roll on it, and I started researching the history of people impersonating Hitler and making Nazi jokes.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the earliest historical examples of jokes about Nazis?
Yeah. So obviously there are a lot of examples that we can look at, but just for this to define the scope of this talk, let's talk about film and television in the Anglo-American context. So anything that was in the English language on film and television. And so there are two films that I discovered that would have been available to the masses in both Britain and in the United States that were made and released around 1940 and 1941. And these are films that you can look up on YouTube, or you can look up on YouTube for free, or I think you can probably rent one of them for a really low price. The first is Charlie Chaplin, The Great Dictator. Charlie Chaplin plays two roles. He plays a fictional dictator who is very clearly Hitler. He's the dictator of Tomania. His name is Hinkle. And they've got something that looks clearly is supposed to be a reference to a swastika. It's a double cross, so it looks like two X's all over the place. And everyone is hiling, but their hile is really high. It's like they're raising their hand in class. So it's very clear who he's talking about. And this dictator really has it in for the Jews. And Charlie Chaplin's other character in the film is a Jewish barber who looks exactly like Hitler. The Hitler character. Mm-hmm. Because Charlie Chaplin's traditional look on screen was very reminiscent of Hitler, with the toothbrush mustache and the slicked hair. So he was also poking fun at himself. And it's really funny when you watch it. There's a lot of... It was one of Charlie Chaplin's first talkies, if not his actual first talkie, which means he was not playing a silent character that was just, miming all the time. He was actually speaking, and he speaks in sort of like a gibberish language that is meant to sound like German, but it's German gibberish. So he's like throwing in words like sauerkraut, Berlin, and just being really over the top and sort of playing this like a really vain guy with delusions of grandeur, but who's also really dangerous and has it in for the Jews.
And what year did this come out?
That was 1940. So it was during World War II. Charlie Chaplin himself was a British actor, but many of the actors that he used in the movie are American. So when if you see the movie, you'll see a variety of accents. You'll see some people mimicking a German accent. You'll see some people with kind of a British accent. And then a lot of the stormtrooper characters actually have kind of New York American accents, which kind of fits with the idea that this is a fictional country named Tomania. So that was released in Europe and in the United States, but it was before the United States entered World War II. And, we look back at that movie in 2017 and we think, wow, this was great. And it was so obvious, but apparently in Hollywood at that time, because America had not entered the war yet, and even though there were a lot of Jews who were in, major executive roles in the studios, it was not really okay to bait the Germans just yet. So he got his release, but there were, he was definitely fighting against the grain in terms of what Hollywood was looking for, what Hollywood was comfortable with before entering the war. And Charlie Chaplin was also very noted for his anti-capitalist views. He's an incredibly political figure throughout his entire filmography. And these particular leftist political views did not make him popular in the United States, and he attracted some attention from the FBI. So we see later in the 1950s, he actually cannot come back to America anymore. So even though he was portraying Hitler in kind of this brilliant way, it wasn't a given that that studio executives were going to receive it very well. But then, America enters the war and then we're all about it again. But yet Charlie Chaplin, as a figure in Hollywood, was never able to really be accepted because of his leftist political views. And also because he kept dating younger women. Not dating, marrying, divorcing, having affairs with younger women, and doing so in a not so quiet way, which I think is what Americans were upset with. Not that he was doing it, but that he wasn't being, quiet about it. So that ties into what we're seeing now in Hollywood, long history of predatory behavior and exploitation of women. Half of the women that he married, I think, were his co-stars as well. But that's another story. The second one is from a comedy troupe that maybe you haven't heard of called The Crazy Gang. And this is a British comedy troupe led by a Jewish Cockney. They were all Cockneys. And just so we're clear on what a Cockney is, it's a particular sort of low-class East End of London kind of dialect, and I was not aware of this, but apparently for a long time, Cockney and Jewish were really intermingled definitions. I didn't realize that. So if you were Cockney, like it's sort of like being a New Yorker. You know, like you're either like Italian or you're Jewish or maybe you're Irish. Like at this particular time in London, if you were Cockney, there was like, you know, you were probably from one of these backgrounds. So this group, this was in 1940. Britain was in the war. Britain was not doing well in the war. They released this film called Gas Bags, where they have a fish and chip shop with a balloon that advertises their fish and chips, and the balloon gets caught in the wind, and their fish and chip shop is carried all the way over to Nazi Germany, and they are sent to a labor camp. And in the labor camp, they start to sing what critics referred to as a schmaltzy song while they're in the labor camp. And then they view like kind of all these horrific things, like all these, you know, workers coming in and, you know, sleeping on top of each other and being shot, and, you know, like the starvation. And they end up escaping the labor camp because one of them is really good at impersonating Hitler. And then all sorts of other hijinks happen and they end up escaping. But throughout the entire movie, you know, the shtick is one of them is impersonating Hitler. They're all impersonating Nazis. And apparently for an audience at the time, they would have easily recognized some of these characters as Jewish, even if I watched the film and I couldn't recognize anything uniquely Jewish about it. I also needed subtitles, and there are no subtitles available.
Because the accents, or because they're speaking German?
The accents.
Okay.
No, because of the Cockney accents, and even if you do know what they're saying, you need like a decoder ring to figure out what the joke is in Cockney. But the point is, it exists, and it was supposed to be a morale booster for the British, and it did very well. It never made it to North America, but it did very well. The Crazy Gang was performing in Britain up until the 1960s, I think. And one of them, the leader, who was a Jewish actor, was knighted. He received an order, or some kind of order. So those are the two examples concurrent to World War II that I found that were most notable.
And then, I mean, it's interesting that both of those are in the early part of the war, and, you know, the full extent of the Nazi atrocities wasn't, you know, really known during, or to the public at large during that time. So then, once you have the revelations of what happened in the Holocaust, it seems like the joking ability to joke about Hitler as a buffoonish figure, you know, gets a lot more complicated.
Right. And I will make a note of two things, actually. One is Charlie Chaplin, in his autobiography in the 1960s, said that he regretted making The Great Dictator, knowing what he knew in the 1960s about what the Nazis did to the Jews. There's even a scene where a character is about to be lynched in the street. And, you know, I was watching that in 2017, you know, knowing all kinds of stuff about what was happening. And I was kind of like, oh no. And I don't know if audiences, you know, watching that in 1940 would have had the same reaction. I mean, obviously lynching someone is pretty horrible, but we know all kinds of things now. There's even a scene where the Hitler character is reviewing, you know, the latest invention, and one of them is a poison gas. And, you know, it doesn't seem like something that should be, you know, we wonder, like, is that okay to joke about? but they didn't know. Charlie Chaplin would regret that. He would later say, like, there was nothing funny about the homicidal mania of the Nazis. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I would say about these two movies is Hitler is not a buffoon. Nazis, even in satire at that time, the foot soldiers might be a little buffoonish, but the officers and Hitler himself are not buffoons. Mm-hmm. They are not incompetent. They are ruthless and calculating. The humor comes from their arrogance and their vanity, not from any kind of stupidity, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So even though this is something to laugh at, this is also something to fear. And I think it toes that line very well, because also you didn't want soldiers going in thinking that this was going to be a piece of cake. Mm-hmm. You know, that the Nazis, you know, that they would win so easily. The case at the time, especially for Britain, was they didn't think they were going to win. You know, they really had it in their head that they were gonna lose. This guy was gonna take over the world. Mm-hmm. So he's not a buffoon until Hitler doesn't become a buffoon until later.
Okay, that's interesting to note. I guess I'm only familiar with The Great Dictator with the scene where he's dancing with the globe. So maybe I need to give that movie a viewing. So Charlie Chaplin will do that, but he also shows it's kind of a mix, you know, because he does show Hinkler, that's his name, Hinkler, being very methodical, very busy, very conniving. You know, he says he wants to get a loan from a very famous rich Jew who lives in the country, and he's going to trick him, you know, so he's smart, you know, he's not incompetent, he's vain, but he's not incompetent. So maybe it's been a while since I've seen the globe scene. So I'm not sure how to interpret it from memory, but it's different than what Mel Brooks does later. Mm-hmm. Are there any films that you looked at between the era of the end of the war and The Producers?
Yes, and I just realized now that I forgot one, mentioning Mel Brooks again. Another one in 1940 is To Be or Not to Be.
Right.
Now, Mel Brooks would remake this in 1983, but the original was done in 1940 by Ernst Lubitsch, who was a Jewish director, and there were Jews among the cast. And it tells the story of a group of Polish actors who are sort of like being forced on stage and who must escape the Nazi occupation. And what they end up doing, these Polish actors, they end up taking a stand and risking their life in order to depict. Okay, so I have not seen the 1940 version, but in the Mel Brooks version, Mel Brooks depicts Hitler as a buffoon. In the 1940 version, I'm not sure that he's a buffoon, but I think the script may have called for it, but it's also a play within a play. Mm-hmm. It's an actor playing something with the intent of pissing off Hitler. But the actual characters who are the Nazis are dangerous. Mm-hmm. And I think they would follow that. They would follow that formula of being conniving and ruthless, but also very arrogant and almost arbitrary in what they decide to crack down on. And then we'll come back to be or not to be in 1983 a little bit later.
Okay, so what is the work that falls after the war but before the seminal Nazi movie of The Producers?
after the war is the producers in 1967. I think after the war, there really was a period where it was not acceptable to talk about. Well, no, I mean, there were plenty of films that came out about World War II, but it was not acceptable to approach it with the same levity. There was no incentive to boost morale, for people still fighting. And so when Mel Brooks made The Producers, he was also talking about elements of fascism that still existed, about the Nazis that escaped and the Nazis that were still around. And maybe also trying to make a point about who was collaborating, who was helping the Nazis the whole time. Mm-hmm. In addition to also lampooning counterculture at the time. He makes fun of the hippie culture that's emerging as well. And he got a lot of pushback for The Producers, and not just from Jewish people, although I think the Jewish community really would come to accept what he was doing much more quickly than the rest of America. But in 1967, it was definitely shocking, absolutely shocking. Then in 1965 to late 1970s was Hogan's Heroes,
right?
Which I have not had the chance to review in any kind of depth. But it existed on American television, and it would later have German Jewish refugees playing characters. I think they would actually play the Nazis, but the whole show had to sidestep the Holocaust. They never touched it. Mel Brooks never touched the Holocaust. Or at least in his, he's done so many jokes over his career that I wouldn't be surprised if he has done a Holocaust joke at one point or another, but the majority of the time he's just making Nazi jokes. Then we have Monty Python and the skit Mr. Hitler.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, so it's it's again Monty Python is not Jewish. They're British, and they're British, not Jewish. And so it's like this small village, and they've got these clearly Nazis. They're in Nazi garb, pretending not to be Nazis. Faking their name, but they've got, really thick German accents. Like, no, certainly I am not Hermann Göring. No. And they keep going around doing Nazi things, and everyone's kind of just excusing him and just not noticing, which I think can be like a metaphor, sort of an allegory, even a very soft allegory for maybe the fascism that still paraded around Britain in the 1970s, with people just looking the other way. Nazi appeasers and just looking the other way. We're not going to notice. And that was the history of Britain and America too. They were late in getting into the war. Not as Britain was not as late as America. But it took a long time for other, world powers to get into the war. It was not immediate. No one looked at Hitler and went immediately, oh, this guy's really bad. We should take him out. We should go to war with him. There was a long history of appeasement before there was war. So I think it's also coming, Mr. Hitler is also coming from that cultural context too. And also coming from a culture that still really bore the scars of war in a way that Americans did not. Something that I noticed when I came to London is that Nazi damage is everywhere. Not all of it has been repaired. And some of it is, most of the Nazi damage that happened, during London air raids is anything really bad was repaired. But there was just, little bits that weren't repaired. And tube stations became air raids. People were starving. The reconstruction area was really hard on Britain. They didn't come out of it very well. I mean, they came out of it, yes, but it didn't. It wasn't a happy time. It wasn't a romantic time. What they were living through, and I think most Americans don't have that memory,
right,
of World War II, of being civilians living through the threat of being killed during war as a civilian. They never lived through that. Maybe the people in Hawaii did, but that's it.
So do you think that makes it easier for an American comedian to make the, turn World War II or Nazism into comedy than for Europeans?
I think when Europeans, I wouldn't say today, but certainly in the 60s and 70s, if they were to make jokes about it, they were doing so from the margins, more so from the margins than I think an American comedian would.
I'm thinking of the Fawlty Towers episode with the Germans coming,
also,
and the joke is don't mention the war. So
John Cleese.
Yeah, so that joke is conceptually about not bringing up. The humor is in the eliding the fact of the war and trying to erase it.
Right, and the social faux pas, because you were likely to come across people who had really lived through it all over Europe, more than you would have in the United States. And saying that, also Mel Brooks was a World War II veteran. He worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, I think, when he was a very young man. And he was stationed in Europe clearing out mines. So he was not just coming from, American Jewry was, partially removed from the horrors of what was happening in Europe, but he was also a soldier.
There was also in the U.S. a reticence for Jews to have self-deprecating humor in the aftermath of World War II. I'm thinking of Philip Roth, and there was a famous incident where after he published Goodbye Columbus, there's a one of the short stories in there is about a two Jewish soldiers at a training camp, and I think during the Korean War, which Roth was in the military during the Korean War but didn't serve in combat, and one of the soldiers is a shirker, and he a malingerer, and he doesn't want to do any work, and his commanding officer is the other Jewish soldier, and he tries to kind of exploit the shared religion and ethnicity in order to make it okay for him to be a shirker. So, and it's this whenever this is published in, I guess, to be either the very late 50s or early 60s, and it caused Roth to be denounced in the pages of commentary or something, and as a gift to the anti-Semites, and he writes about this and fictionalizes it a couple different ways, but he received a long letter from the chief rabbi of Newark or something, explaining how he was continuing doing Hitler's work by writing about Jews in a self-deprecatory way.
So I'm not familiar with Philip Roth. Did that end his career for the time?
No, he continued on, and so his initial work in Goodbye Columbus was his initial stuff was short stories about Jews in New Jersey, and was kind of mildly mocking of their lifestyle. But then he published Portnoy's Complaint in '67, I think, which was just like a total explosion of making fun of his Jewish upbringing and Jewish stereotypes, and so he really rebelled against the strictures that the community, the community elders wanted to put on him, and wrote about Jews and sexually explicit stuff for like the next 50 years. I highly recommend Portnoy's Complaint for anyone who hasn't read it. It's very funny.
Okay. I haven't followed Philip Roth very closely, and I think I mentioned I was just trying to focus on films and TV. But I do know that there is quite a wealth of both theater and literature that probably could never be made into film or television for the masses, of Jewish humor on the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. There was a Hungarian Jewish man whose entire family was killed in Auschwitz. His name was George Tabori. And he wrote I think his entire career was writing plays about Nazism and the Holocaust. One of his comedies is based in a labor camp called The Cannibals. And it's about prisoners in a labor camp deciding that they're going to eat one of the other prisoners in order to stay alive. Mm-hmm. And it's a comedy. And no one could really approach him. I mean, they could, and I'm sure they did. He was working from London, but his plays would be put on in New York and London. So he fled Hungary to London, and then I think everyone but his mother died in Auschwitz. So he wrote these plays that were incredibly personal. And one of his other really famous plays is Mein Kampf, where it's a Hitler impersonation, but he did a Holocaust joke, mm-hmm. a labor camp joke, a cannibalism joke.
Let's
to great acclaim.
Yeah, let's pause here. So I'm thinking about like the theories of comedy, and people. It continues to be studied, like why exactly things are funny, and there's different theories. There's Mel Brooks mm-hmm. famously said, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die." There's also comedy equals tragedy plus time. I've heard comedy equals truth plus pain is comedy. Mm-hmm. And then there's this new guy who's doing research where he came up with the term benign violation theory. Are you familiar with this one? Mm-mm. So it's kind of like so if you like see someone walking down the street and they fall down, that's not funny because they're possibly injured. If in a cartoon someone slips on a banana peel, and why is that like the classic joke? It's because there's a sense of threat, but then no one is actually hurt in the end. So it's a benign violation. Right. And I'm not sure how much I buy this theory, but it is interesting to think about. It's, there's some kind of threat, and then you cross a boundary, but in a way that is not actually harmful, and that's what provokes laughter. So tragedy plus time, the Holocaust was a tragedy, and it's been 70 years, but we're still not, mm-hmm. you just don't see a lot of Holocaust jokes. Why, do you have any thoughts about why is it so hard to make a Holocaust joke? Why there's some jokes that can be made, some jokes that we say mm-hmm. are taboo? I mean, there's also the jokes, the anti-Semitic jokes that,
right.
Target Jews, and there's a lot of being Jewish. I heard some of these growing up, and there's a lot of them that are Holocaust jokes and relate to the destruction of Jewish bodies in the Holocaust, mm-hmm. Gas chambers and crematoriums and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But those are, explicitly seen as offensive anti-Semitic jokes. Do you have any thoughts about where we draw this line? Why sometimes it's okay, but most of the time it's not?
Yeah. So there is a documentary that Mel Brooks is in that PBS did, which I've been able to see clips of, but not see the thing in its entirety. But it includes Mel Brooks, Rob Reiner, and Sarah Silverman, and probably some other voices of them talking about Holocaust jokes and Auschwitz jokes. And I think it was the clip I saw with Rob Reiner that says the Holocaust is not funny. There's nothing funny about the Holocaust, but surviving the Holocaust, there's humor in that.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say Holocaust jokes, it's just sort of like a broad term that can include that kind of like uplifting survivor, like I survived, and I'm going to enjoy life, kind of laughter. And then the, laughing at someone else's pain. And I think the identity of the person who's making the joke also matters.
Mm-hmm.
Not being a Jewish person myself, I don't feel qualified to decide whether or not a certain joke is anti-Semitic, or if it's like, if a Jewish person is actually doing the work of Hitler by saying it. I can only tell you like what the consensus has become in the Jewish community, which is that Mel Brooks was doing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the consensus of the Jewish community. That's not my judgment. But many people who are not Jewish have done Nazi jokes that are perfectly fine. One of the ones that I wanted to get into, which is much more modern, is a British one. You can look this up on YouTube. It's and I come back to this skit all the time. It's called. Actually, I don't know what the skit is called, but everyone calls it "Are We the Baddies?"
That's what I thought you were going to say. Yeah, I've seen references to that, and we'll find the YouTube and link to it below. But only just watched it within the past couple of weeks, actually. Yeah, that is a very striking
and
one.
It's for people who aren't aware, it's these two British comedians who are playing SS soldiers out in the trenches, and then one of them looks at the other and goes like, "I've just noticed that there are skulls on our uniforms. Does that mean we're the villains?" And like just sort of making fun of like how obvious it was that they were on the wrong fucking side.
It's a deep point, because no one is like, yes, I am bad. Everyone always thinks that what they're doing is essentially good. And even the Nazis thought they were serving some ultimate good purpose.
So, I mean, when it comes to Nazi jokes, I think centering the Jewish experience is important, even if you're not Jewish. There are Nazi jokes that don't include generally anything about Jews, and they're usually like short little skits. Like Mr. Hitler, I don't think has anything to do with Jews. Are We the Baddies doesn't have anything to do with Jews.
Mm-hmm. There was a genre of joke that went around roughly like 8 years ago, which was the clip from the movie Downfall, re-subtitled to be about anything else. I think one of them was that I remember seeing was during the 2008 campaign, and Hitler was being repurposed as Hillary Clinton, and about the collapse of her primary campaign. Right. So that plays on the kind of contrast between like the histrionic performance and the history of what was actually happening versus the banality of joking about like layoffs at a company or your video game not working correctly or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think what's also really important in considering what's ethical comedy, because obviously what is funny is incredibly subjective. But in terms of what is ethical, you also have to examine the power relations of the people involved.
Right.
Who's making it? Who's laughing at it? And what do the people who have or had the least amount of power think about the joke? So, I mean, you have to examine all these things together. You can't just pull Mr. Hitler out of a hat without recognizing who the actors were, what audiences thought of it, what Jewish audiences might have thought of it, or what other people who would have been victims of the Nazis thought of it. You can't look at it without that.
Yeah, people in who talk about comedy call this like punching up, punching down. It's okay to in the like most broad terms like a white person making fun of a black person, not okay. Black person making fun of a white person, usually okay.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people online who don't seem to get that basic thing, and that does kind of seem to lead to a lot of these like jokes that were made and get people in trouble.
And whether or not someone perceives your joke as ethical has a lot to do with whether or not they find it funny. Mm-hmm. It might be close to a line, and they'll still find it funny. But if they feel it absolutely crosses the line, then they pull back, and they decide it's not funny.
Yeah. So, when I was in college, I was on the humor magazine, and it was right after the. This was in 2005. It was right after the tsunami of like 2004, and I remember we had like an Onion style insert in there, and someone who was another student pitched a joke about the tsunami. And I remember that it wasn't a good joke, but I remember thinking like, you have this like unimaginable human catastrophe, like so much so that you can't really get a grasp on it. But then like, how do you make a joke about that? Is it even possible? I remember saying at the time like, you can make a joke about the reaction to it, like the media obsession with it, but not about the fact that like it's that a bunch of people did die. And then I remember thinking about this when I was like deciding which jokes would go in the magazine. Like, if you're edging on something that's possibly offensive, like it really has to be funny. But then that's such a subjective thing. And now looking back on it, I'm not sure if I would keep that, like, it's okay to be offensive if you actually are funny. That's probably what I believed when I was 21 years old, but I'm not sure if I would still stick to that standard. I have to think about it some more.
Yeah. So I don't know how much time we have left. I don't know how much time is going to get shaved off of this at the end. So, and we could go on some of these subjects for a while, but there were some other topics that I wanted to get into, and so sure. I'll try and keep this portion brief. So, and jumping from Nazi jokes and Holocaust jokes, I want to jump to something a little bit more modern, which is anti-jihadi jokes. And the power relations in this are very different when we're talking about Anglo-American context, because we're talking about people that are not living under a repressive jihadi regime. Being in London now, I have lived through, not personally up close. I have lived through quite way more terrorist attacks than I ever did when I was in the States, which can be a little jarring. But I cannot compare the way I live my life daily to the way that people live their life in Baghdad. Mm-hmm. So someone making an anti-ISIS joke here or making a anti-jihadi joke here is very different than them making it in Baghdad. And they do it in Baghdad and other places. But I just want to draw a distinction between that. So one of the most politically incorrect films of all time, of this era, is Four Lions. And it is absolutely hilarious, and it is absolutely unoffensive. And this was done by a white British director, a white non-Muslim British director, about a bunch of bumbling jihadi idiots of British Muslim, Pakistani, Arabic background, although there is one white convert to jihadi. And this was made in like 2005 or 2006, before ISIS entered our lexicon. Mm-hmm. And these bumbling British idiots are trying to plan a terrorist attack in London, and they screw it up really badly. They just keep screwing it up because they're so stupid. And it is so hilarious. And Riz Ahmed, who is much more famous now than he was back in 2005, 2006, is the star. And the director, Chris Morris, went to great lengths to include British Muslims in the joke. And so they are also making fun of people in their own community. And people who are ravaging their community from the inside as well as from the outside. and they screened it in all kinds of places, and they got all kinds of feedback. And I have not found any British Muslim of note who has written a scathing review of that film, and it's fantastic. And it definitely plays against your sensibilities. And I think in 2017, when I watched that film, I can only watch it in clips, because the thing about British humor that I don't remember where I've heard this, but it's so true. Like, it's hilarious and incredibly sad at the same time. And that's what it's like watching Four Lions. It is hilarious and incredibly sad all at the same time. And it's another one of those films that you need subtitles for as an American watching a British film. But there are other people in the Anglo-American context who have really made jokes about terrorism and jihadis. And one of the other ones is another British one, Carl Sharrow, who tweets as Carl Remarks. He also has a blog. And he's great because people have tried to lionize these anti-jihadi, anti-ISIS jokes and make it be like a new weapon against the jihadis. And Carl Sharrow's like, no, I don't think so. we're just joking. You need to, it's not going to have that much of an impact on ISIS. That we're making fun of them. It can maybe change perceptions about the diaspora, and Muslim communities who live in, the West, and understand that they do not recognize these people as part of their community. When I say these people, I mean the jihadis and, the ISIS fighters. They see them as objects of derision, to be outcast and to be ridiculed. And they are buffoons. But even saying that they are buffoons, we know that buffoons can be incredibly dangerous. If you give a chimp a machine gun, just because it's not smart enough, to know what the machine gun is for, doesn't mean that it can't, cause a lot of destruction with a machine gun. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about with terrorist jokes. I haven't heard too much terrorist jokes in the States. I think it's kind of taboo.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the tragedy plus time. Like, I don't know. I think about, The Onion put out an issue all about 9/11 right after the attack, and there were people, wondering if comedy would ever return, and then it was seen as a real, step on the path to return to normalcy when SNL and Letterman came back on, coming from New York, and The Onion put out this amazing issue about it just 2 weeks after the attack. I guess so. One thing I do want to mention, if anyone hasn't seen the movie Inglourious Bastards, that is a hybrid kind of action comedy drama take on World War II and the Holocaust that I think is brilliant, and people will be watching 50 years from now. And it's kind of about the ability of art to triumph over the tragedies of history. And so I just recommend that for anyone who hasn't seen it. The other maybe final point we can discuss is, there's, I guess I'm interested in the moral place of the comedian in our society, and this relates to the headlines because within the past couple days, a photo emerged of Senator Al Franken taking a jokey shot, as he intended it to be, either groping or simulating groping a sleeping woman, and he was a civilian, a comedian, not a politician, and we look to politicians to be moral leaders, but when they fail, sometimes we look to comedians, which is really weird. Sometimes they do have moral authority. I think someone like Jon Stewart did have a form of moral authority based on his work. But I've also thought about how it's dangerous to give moral authority to a comedian, because a comedian wants laughs. That's like that's the currency of comedy, is laughter, and they will go for a laugh ahead of going for doing what is right. So that seems to be what Al Franken, who was a hilarious person and someone I previously admired, went for a laugh ahead of doing while doing something pretty wrong. And Louis C.K. had a kind of moral authority to talk about gender and sexual violence and race, and he was at the same time abusing women. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. I don't think I can add anything about the abusing women part that hasn't already been said. So I will leave it to people that are a little bit more eloquent on the topic. Although I completely agree that it's despicable and there's no excuse. And I mentioned Charlie Chaplin earlier. Charlie Chaplin would have been like this Louis C.K. figure, who had this, well, for people of a left-leaning political, ideology, when they found out, maybe later that he had this horrible string of relationships with younger women, like, oh no, but I have to excuse it because Charlie Chaplin was so important to, the politics, Charlie Chaplin's so important to my politics, and Al Franken is so important to my politics, and Louis C.K. is so important to my politics. And, I didn't know that much about Al Franken, but definitely Louis C.K. was important to my politics. Prior to this, and prior to me knowing about Charlie Chaplin's proclivities, yes, I would say that he was important. And the string here is that they're all men, and white men. And you've just got Trevor Noah, who is the new Daily Show host, who inherited it from Jon Stewart, will never reach the heights of moral authority that Jon Stewart has. Why? But that's another discussion. I completely forgot where I was going with this. So the comedian and going for the laugh instead of doing what's right. So I gotta be a typical Soas kid and talk about the Frankfurt School. And there was someone in the Frankfurt School who was not a fan of Charlie Chaplin, and there was someone in the Frankfurt School who was a fan of Charlie Chaplin. And the one who didn't like Charlie Chaplin was Theodor Adorno. And Theodor Adorno was German, fled Germany. The whole Frankfurt School, that's their thing. They fled Germany during the rise of fascism, and then they wrote all these books and papers about how the culture industry had given rise to Hitler. Adorno's caution was that the desire to entertain and mass produce entertainment for, the lowest common denominator would trump, any other incentive to spread a message. So it was, for Adorno, it was inherently the forces of capitalism that would create the wrong incentives and ultimately give rise to fascism. Walter Benjamin, however, was a big fan of Charlie Chaplin and saw the anti-capitalist messages in Charlie Chaplin's work. And he really liked The Great Dictator and another film of his called Modern Times. And there's a good argument to be made that Charlie Chaplin was not making mass-produced films with big budgets and, raking in all this money because of what he was making. It was just not the context of the time. Nowadays, that's much more That's much more applicable. And I would say that Alec Baldwin's impersonation of Trump sort of fits with that caution, is that the Trump impersonation, like on SNL, they have a week, to turn out a script and base it and, use that week's current events. And so the incentive is not really there to refine it and make it smart. The incentive is just to get it out. And so frequently their skits with Trump and other, Trump-related characters kind of fall flat.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look, I
would agree. I don't think SNL has done a good job with Trump, and they invited him on to host in the fall of 2015, which helped, not normalize him exactly, but gave him a platform and helped, was another
right. And
item
that's what Adorno would be talking about, is it's not subversive if you're doing it for the ratings, and you're just churning this stuff out with no thought behind it. You just got to hit that mark. There are some good Trump skits from SNL, but there are a lot more that fall flat than ever became really good. I can't even remember when the last good one was, though, that I felt made a statement. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about Trump humor in this day and age, and I've seen some comedians say this, and I'm not going to name their names, but they know who they are. And their fans know who they are, is they come out and they say that comedians are leading the resistance, or that comedy is a part of the resistance. And I'm sorry, but in 2017, comedy is part of the problem with Trump and the rise of Trump. And maybe I'm not seeing it because I'm not currently in the States. I left the States before Trump even became a candidate. But Trump jokes sell. Everybody loves Trump jokes. Everyone loves to make fun of him because they all hate him, Everyone in the entertainment industry, I think over 75% of the entertainment industry, of course, there are, people that like him, but they have no career. Any power player in the entertainment industry hates Trump, and they know that if they get up there at the Academy Awards and they make a speech against Trump, they're going to get a standing ovation, and so that gives an incentive for people. I'm not saying Al Franken in particular, maybe, but people like Al Franken, comedians like Al Franken, can start to, sort of aggrandize themselves. I'm part of the resistance because I'm getting up here making a Trump joke. A comedian might be part of the resistance because they are also individual members of, different civic coalitions, that they're doing something else off stage. And then, yes, they are part of the resistance, mm-hmm. however you want to call it. But the comedy itself is too well accepted for it to actually be a tool of resistance.
So you're saying because it's not subversive to make fun of Trump? Is that
It's not.
Right. Yeah, this could be a whole nother conversation. I guess I would say I would go back to my point about comedians. It's very hard for a comedian to be a moral leader because they want the joke. It can happen sometimes. I mean, Colbert's White House Correspondents' Dinner speech in, I think it was 2006, I think 2005 or 2006, where he just excoriated Bush to his face as the bloviating right-wing character he played. I thought it is an important historical moment, and it was kind of the emperor has no clothes moment of the Bush administration, so it can happen. This is such a complicated issue. I mean, because the thing is that Trump himself is an inherently unserious, farcical, absurd person, and mm-hmm. so it's are you playing his game? He had a Comedy Central roast about himself. back when he was just on The Apprentice. But a note for that, he was fine with people making fun of his hair. He wasn't fine with people making fun of the fact that he's not as rich as he pretends to be.
And let's bring up that Jimmy Kimmel.
Yeah, Jimmy Kimmel mussed up his hair.
Mussed up his hair, and he became part of the problem. So, I mean, comedians are as much a part of the problem of Trump as they are, possibly part of the solution. Because obviously, laughter is an important part of building solidarity.
Yeah, and what became the symbol of the Women's March and is still kind of a symbol of the resistance is a pussy hat, which is like a pun joke about Trump's statement about groping women. So yeah, this is super complicated. Maybe we should come back and do an entire episode about this.
I don't wanna talk about Trump all the time.
Yeah. Okay. So viewers and listeners out there,
10 minutes, maybe like a third of the podcast.
This episode was
the whole thing.
85% non-Trump. We had the people demand a little bit of Trump, but not too much. So maybe we should wrap it up there.
Yeah. I mean, it's important, but I feel, me being overseas and maybe, in a way I want to feel connected to what's happening, that I maybe overdose on it a little bit. And I'm all like, no, I got to remember that there are other things in this world that are just as important. And, I need to keep some kind of balance because, sometimes I read the news. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And then I go outside and no one is making the same kind of like bulgy what the fuck eyes as I am, because Catalonia is exploding and there's Brexit going on, they've got like a much more balanced view of all the shit problems in the world, and the Trump issues only come around not that often. Like if I go out and I'm like, do you believe what Jeff Sessions just said? They'll be like, who's Jeff Sessions?
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that is that is partially because you're not in the States, but I have to take this as an opportunity to plug a project that I am working on with Bob Wright, Blogging Heads Impresario Bob Wright, called Mindful Resistance. It's at mindfulresistance.net. So one of the things we're trying to do with this project is figure out what are the things that actually matter that happen every week, that are aside from the media circus and the kind of constant, sense of like, what is the latest thing that Trump did that's outrageous, and try to figure out like what we need to actually focus on and a smarter way to oppose Trump. So it's a newsletter you can sign up for, mindfulresistance.net. And we're figuring it out as we go along.
Yeah, that's definitely. I think that's definitely helpful. And I don't want to sound like people are unconcerned with Trump. It's just that they're not following every little detail. And Trump has a way of selling news stories that come from the States in a way that the European media doesn't try and do. Whenever a film comes out, they try and make. Okay, so let me make an example. All right, one of my favorite musicians, Lana Del Rey. Are you familiar with Lana Del Rey? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Lana Del Rey has nothing to do with politics. And I was watching this interview that she did with the magazine, and they were like, "What does your album say about the Trump era?" And I'm like, "What? Why are you asking Lana Del Rey about Trump?"
Do you know that there's a popular leftist Twitter account called Lana Del Raytheon?
Yes.
So so people want to rope in pop culture, and it's so complicated.
And that's fine if they want to do it. If you're a political individual and you want to like make this pop culture reference. But there is nothing Lana Del Rey has done which has any effect on, this. And they're just shoehorning it in. Just like, we got to put this in. We got to make this headline. Lana Del Rey slams Trump.
Yeah. And on the other side is the effort to either get Taylor Swift to denounce Trump or reveal Taylor Swift as a secret Trump supporter. She is carefully never revealed a political opinion, but I've seen there was an essay that I think ran on Vulture that said that the first music video that came out for her soon to be released album was like the first work of like Trump era pop art. Because of its obsession with like grievances and self-image, and so I see it both ways. Like you can read pop culture and art through a political lens, but also like you want something to like retreat to that has nothing to do with
and I feel like there's just an incentive. There's just an incentive in the media to like always capture a celebrity saying something against Trump that could, like maybe start some kind of Twitter beef. Like I feel like sometimes people are courting the Trump tweet.
Yeah, like picking a fight with Trump is a way to get attention. I mean, just on what comes to mind for the other side of this is like the two articles that revealed that Harvey Weinstein is a predator were seem to me like they're, some of the most journalism has the biggest impact since like the Pentagon Papers. Like American society is changing because of these articles, and it was about famous female actresses who decided to finally come forward with their accounts of being attacked by him. So, Rose McGowan and Ashley Judd came forward, and they are, Hollywood celebrities, but they're, the news continues to churn because of this. So it's you can't this wall off.
It's changed. It's definitely changed American society, and it has also had an effect on European society as well. I can't speak for any of the other countries, but both British media and French news media have been, British and French society have been starting to address. Have been taking advantage of the publicity to start addressing sexual harassment on TV and in government. Kevin Spacey's predicament was also partially took place in London at the Old Vic Theatre, and so that involves British theatre figures, covering for him. But there are now attempts to sort of sweep Parliament of the harassers. The Minister of Defense, I think it was, just resigned. Like he's just gone, and whenever this airs, maybe you guys can forgive me for not knowing all the details about his resignation, whether or not they come to light. But it was just kind of like, this guy is gone, and we have a pretty good reason to believe it's because of some kind of sexual misconduct, but we don't know what. And then there are other parliamentarians who are being pushed out or having allegations thrown at them, and so it's just a huge sweep all over the place, which speaks to the influence that Hollywood has over, Euro-American culture.
Okay, why don't we wrap it up there? Thanks so much for coming on. If people want to find more of your work, where can they find it?
I keep a pretty good record of all of it on my blog, sideofsuffering.tumblr.com. I'm also on Twitter a lot, and you can find the link to my Twitter on my blog as well. So you can follow me at the Odalisque, or you can check out my Tumblr blog.
Okay, cool. And you can subscribe to this show in iTunes if you haven't done so already. You can follow me on Twitter, REACW. And that's the self-promotion I'll do. So, Christa, thanks again for coming on.
All right, great. Thanks. Bye.